My name is Rick Hendriks, and I'm here on behalf of Tribal Chief Liz Logan. Now, Tribal Chief Liz Logan, you're really getting the second best today, I have to say. She has long silver hair, and of course I have short hair, and mine's sort of gray, it's not really silver. She drives a Harley Davidson, and I drive a Honda Civic. She wears nice jewelry, and you really don't want to see me in jewelry. So, but nonetheless, I am here to talk a little bit about something quite hopeful, actually, the potential end of the dam age. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to remove the dams that are already there, but there's a real possibility that we might stop building the big ones. So I guess my message is fairly hopeful. I'm going to speak a little bit about the proposed Site C clean energy project, and then about Treaty 8 Tribal Association's sort of response to that. And our response is really one of wisdom, unity, and courage. And I think we heard all three of those this morning from the two presenters. And then I'm going to break one of the rules that I gave to my students when I used to teach at the university. Never do a presentation with words longer than 10 letters. So I have a couple terms that I'm going to explain so that you can follow along with me throughout the presentation. One of them is called reconciliation. Show of hands, do people have a sense of what reconciliation means? Okay, that's almost all of you, that's good. It means, the way I'm going to use that word is really to balance the rights of the Crown to take up land and to, in a sense, look out for the interests of the broader society against your rights to use the land, your treaty and Aboriginal rights. So reconciliation is kind of a process of balancing between those two sets of rights. And the second fancy word I'm going to use is called alternatives. And in the context of hydroelectric development, I'm talking about what if we didn't build the dam and we did something else? Maybe we used less electricity, or maybe we used solar power, or maybe we used wind power, some combination. Think of it like a menu, all right? You go into a restaurant and there's a menu. And imagine in your mind something that you really don't want to eat. Something that's unhealthy, something that tastes bad, something that's maybe unhealthy for your family. That's kind of like Site C. So when we talk about alternatives, we're talking about the menu of options available for eating, and Site C is among that menu. And finally, I'm going to chat a little bit about, well, what does all that mean for the end of the potential end of the dam age? So this is Site C. Picture of Site C. It always looks pretty when the company puts their materials out. It's a big dam, 200 feet high, 1,100 megawatts. You know, what the heck does that mean, 1,100 megawatts? Or 5 terawatt hours. Just a fancy way of saying a lot of electricity for about close to 500,000 homes. So I don't know how many homes are here in Edmonton, but it's probably less than that, actually. Probably about, I would guess, 200,000 homes. So double Edmonton. So it's a big power project. We say that it's enough to power a large number of mines and a large number of fracking operations, because we know that that's really what the power is for. The people of British Columbia don't really need the power. It's industry who needs the power. So it's also a large reservoir, 83 kilometers long, and it would flood a significant portion of the Peace River Valley. A number of new roads and infrastructure, new transmission lines. It's a major industrial undertaking. So that's the Peace River Valley, just upstream of, that's probably about 30 kilometers upstream of the dam site. And this area would be flooded as well. So it's flooding from the dam site 80 some odd kilometers upstream. How many of you have been on have anyone here been on the Peace River in British Columbia? So a few people. It is really a spectacular place. has a long history, cultural history, currently used very, very much by the communities. Certainly that came through in our traditional land use study that was recently done. And so of course there's many negative consequences from this project. Effects on wildlife migration and habitat. So those islands that you see there, that's prime habitat for ungulates. Fish migration. We know that fish, particularly bull trout, below the location of the dam, migrate upstream into the tributaries. So we know that by placing a dam there, that's going to have effects on those fish. Obviously, they're flooding cultural and heritage, gathering places, burial grounds, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the effects on land use. And as many of you here in Alberta are familiar with, cumulative effects. This is not the first dam on the Peace River. If this project is built, it would be the third dam on the Peace River. And many of you are familiar with the consequences of the earlier dams. Those consequences went all the way downstream to the Peace Athabasca Delta. And I won't get into that today because I think many of you are very familiar with that. All of this comes together to make for impacts on treaty rights. Sorry, just another picture. These are some erosion stacks. There's some very interesting locations within this valley that would be flooded by the project. A picture of the valley. This is overlooking an area known as Bear Flats, which is a traditional gathering area that's been used by the Denizah for centuries, millennia really. It's also the location in which a treaty of sorts was negotiated between the Cree and the Denizah a couple hundred years ago. So there's some very important locations in the valley that would be flooded. So what's the response from the communities? The response, I think, was best articulated by Jerry Atachi, who's an elder with the Doig First Nation, when he said, wisdom, unity, courage is really the response. It has to be the response. We're going to have to be smart about fighting this project. We're going to have to work together. And at times, as you saw this morning, we're going to have to get out there and show our emotion. And that's really the approach that the nations have taken up. The wisdom piece comes in with respect to reconciliation. Sitting down with government, with the company, who's also a Crown corporation, BC Hydro, trying to consult and accommodate to see if we can come up with something different. The unity piece is in the political relationships and the alliances. And the courage is through the public and media campaign that we're running. So I'm going to give you a chance to read that, actually. Anyone not finished? We don't actually disagree with this, fundamentally. We think that the Government Canada has that part right, actually. The problem comes in, as I will speak about shortly, as to what they're doing to ensure that that doesn't happen. That's just a picture of the commemorating the treaty, if you will, signed between the Denizah and the Cree on the Peace River. So I'm here today representing 4 First Nations, the Doig River First Nation, the Halfway River First Nation, Prophet River First Nation, and West Moberly First Nations. We've also been working with regional First Nations, both upstream and downstream of the project, and many of those nations have signed on to the declaration against the Site C project. We're also very involved with local and provincial environmental organizations. So we're really working to bring a group of people together to demonstrate opposition to this project. In terms of the courage piece, we have had a number of public protests of various forms. Many of you here may have participated in the rally at the legislature in Victoria back in 2010. We have an active media campaign against the project. And every year we have the Paddle for the Peace, which I had the pleasure to participate in this year. So this is one of our recent demonstrations at a BC Hydro public presentation. Some examples of media coverage of some of the actions that we've taken. And the next year's paddle will be on July 13th, 2013. It's always the second Saturday in July, so you're welcome to attend. As I say, I went for the first time this year, and it was really quite an event. We had over 1,000 participants this year, so it was very well attended. So that was kind of the easy part of the presentation. And now I want to speak to a little bit about what Crystal was getting at and what happens sort of behind the scenes to lead to the development of some of these projects that nobody really wants. Reconciliation, as I mentioned, it's really about balancing the right of the Crown, because the Crown does have rights. They have a right to take up land. But that right needs to be balanced against your rights under your treaty. And I heard some examples this morning where that balance has not been very well followed by the Crown. And there's a second part to the reconciliation. It's not just about you and the Crown. It's about the Crown's reconciliation of the broader needs of the society against your needs. So in this case, we're talking about the Aboriginal interest to exercise rights in the Peace River Valley against the societal interest in the form of a need for electricity. So I'm going to give you a chance to read that. Actually, I'll read it out loud. So I want to speak about the first one, which is reconciling the Crown's right to take up land against your rights as Aboriginal peoples. This is what the company wrote. The company wrote this. This is BC Hydro talking. They said the purpose of the project is to maximize the development of hydroelectric potential on the Peace River between their existing project, which is the Peace Canyon Generating Station, and the site of the proposed C project. So basically what they're saying, and it goes on, and in a cost-effective manner, but the part I want to emphasize is the first part. If you're supposed to be balancing your rights against their rights, how is it that they can come in from the beginning and say, well, we're going to take everything. We're going to maximize the potential. Right? So that's how the balance gets thrown out of whack. They assume from the outset that everything belongs to them and that you have to negotiate it back. Everyone clear on that? So they only considered hydro development alternatives that flooded the whole valley between those two locations. They never considered, well, maybe we're only going to build one small project, or maybe we're going to not build any projects. All right? They only looked at options that flooded everything. Now, they looked at one dam, flooding all the way back, and they said, well, maybe we'll just build two dams, one lower, one here, and we'll flood to here, and we'll build another dam and flood all the way back, or different options. But they never considered any options that didn't flood the whole thing. And this was all dictated by the Crown. We asked BC Hydro, we said to them outright, who forced you to do it this way? And they said, those are our directions from the province. So there's far too narrow of a consideration of development alternatives to allow for reconciliation. There's the possibility for balance is taken away from the outset. So what about the second aspect of reconciliation? Reconciling the Crown's, reconciliation by the Crown of your interests against society's interests. So in this area, the Crown's been up to been up to their tricks here as well. They know they have to consult with you. But they want to make sure that before they talk about the menu with you, they figured out what's on the menu. So the way that they do that is they undertake a process called integrated resources planning. And this is the process that establishes the need for more electricity. Now, whether the need is real or not is open to debate. They also put in place the province a Clean Energy Act. So this Clean Energy Act establishes the objectives or the preferred alternatives for electricity in the province and the prohibitions, the things that aren't going to be allowed. And many of you are probably familiar with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which was recently rewritten by the Conservative government. That also influences the things that are available on the menu, the alternatives to Site C. So the possibility for reconciliation is substantially undermined even before the consultation starts. So I'm just going to give you a few details about how they do this. In this planning process, this integrated resources plan, the need for electricity is determined and then met through the most cost-effective means. Yeah, it's true, they try to put in some conservation and to mitigate the need, but they never question the need. They never stop and say, well, maybe we're taking too much. Maybe our requirements for electricity are too great. Maybe we're building an economy that can't be sustained based on the resources that are available. They assume that your lands and resources that are required to meet the need are available. They're going to take first. You're going to negotiate back later. So they assume from the outset that treaty lands in BC are available for the development of electricity, whether it's hydro, wind, what have you. There's no provisions for the setting aside of lands for the exercise of your rights. That happens later during consultation. So they're setting up the menu. This is their process of setting up the menu. And during this planning process, there was minimal consultation with First Nations. The second way they do this is this Clean Energy Act. So it limits so-called the non-clean sources of generation. So they effectively eliminate any alternatives that might involve fossil fuels. And don't get me wrong, I don't like climate change either. However, there are trade-offs involved by doing this. By saying we're not going to develop any more fossil fuels, you are de facto saying that we're going to dam a lot more rivers. There's only one gas plant in British Columbia of any size. This act limits severely the operation of that plant, largely because the plant is located in the lower mainland, where most of the constituents are in the province. They ban all nuclear electricity. I don't like electricity either. But you see what they're doing here. They're shortening the menu before they consult with you about the menu. They prohibit the development of, this was an interesting piece. They ban development on all other large rivers, like all other large-scale hydroelectric developments in the province. They banned them, which in a way is not a bad thing. I mean, it's preventing these large projects from happening. But you see what they're doing. They're forcing the decision towards Site C. They're getting rid of all the options on the menu so that that's the only one left and you're just going to have to live with it. They also exempted Site C from review by the Utilities Commission. So just in case, Site C might prove to be unpalatable to the population, they made sure that the proper review of the project would not take place. So this was all done in 2010, and no consultation of any kind with First Nations on this act. Yeah. This is the BC government, yeah. We'll come to our friends from Canada. So Canada recently changed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. And among many other changes, the Act's a whole rewrite of the Act, and I don't want to get into that, and you've probably heard that from others. But I want to focus on one thing that hasn't been really talked about very much. And that is they changed the consideration of what we call the need for and alternatives to a project. And they never consulted with any First Nations about the Act. They just went ahead and did it. So this is what the old Act said. So every environmental assessment, screening, comprehensive study, mediation, panel, those are just types of environmental assessments. So every environmental assessment shall include a consideration of the following factors. Any matter relevant to the environmental assessment, such as the need for the project and alternatives to the project, that basically the responsible authority, so that's the person in charge of the environmental assessment, or the minister may require to be considered. So it's very clear that the need and alternatives for the project is up for consideration under the Act. This is the new Act. The environmental assessment of a designated project must take into account the following factors: the purpose of the designated project and any other matter relevant to the environmental assessment, etc., from the minister. So they took it out. They just took it out. Of course, the purpose of the designated project is open to broad interpretation. You could say that the need and the alternatives are included in the purpose, perhaps, but there's no strict requirement anymore. So to summarize the changes from the Canadian government, the discretion has always been with the minister. But by de-emphasizing the need for and alternatives to a project, it further undermines the potential for reconciliation. So what does all this mean? I can say with confidence that many things are now undermining the potential for large hydro development. High initial capital costs. These things are not cheap to build. Site C is $8 billion at last estimate. It will be over $10 billion in the event they ever put a shovel in the ground. The energy that comes from them is quite expensive. Long lead times. What that means is that you can decide today that you want to have electricity from one of these projects, but it'll be 10 years until you get it. Long cost recovery periods. So because you're taking a big debt, you take on a big mortgage. So you have to keep selling electricity from the project for a long period of time before you pay off your debt. There's new technologies, and they're changing rapidly. Talked about iPhones and other things. But also on the energy side, where things are changing dramatically in the last decade. For example, solar. The cost of solar has dropped. It's like going off a cliff. All right. In fact, the governments of the United States and Canada are considering imposing tariffs on Chinese imports because of fear that the prices are going too low too fast and it will be disruptive for the industry here. Our conservation potential is still enormous. I just give you an example, and I'm not going to toot my own horn, but I do try to practice what I preach. My home is just a typical post-war 1940s home. I bought it in 2004. And I set out on a plan to do what anyone else could do. When things broke down, I replaced them with the most efficient option. So my consumption of electricity for the first 3 years I owned my home was about 11,000 kilowatt hours. Don't worry about the kilowatt hours, but just remember the number 11,000. So my consumption in 2013 will be 4,000 kilowatt hours. So I didn't do anything fancy. I'm not capturing, the waste heat from my toilet or anything like that. I just did what anyone else could do and reduced my consumption by about 2/3. So the potential is there, but we really need to look at how do we realize that potential. And we're getting better at that, but it's not as simple as it seems. These projects are also far away from the market. So you have to build transmission infrastructure to get there. So all the big hydro projects that are left, they're in the north. They're in treaty territories across Canada. The need, if there is a need, is either in industry or it's in the south, where the load centers are. And of course, now we're talking cumulative effects. When we first started looking at these projects in the 1950s and 60s, it was hinterland, The only thing out there was the Indians. It's not true anymore. When you propose these projects, you're proposing them in an environment that's already significantly disturbed by other development. The ability for the land to take up more change is greatly diminished. The ability of your people to take up more change is also greatly diminished. And the best sites are already built. So all this gives me hope. that we're finally going to get off this big dam idea. So, to summarize, many factors are indicating that large hydro projects, and particularly those with dams and storage reservoirs, are not likely to be developed. However, governments continue to facilitate these dams by undermining the consideration of alternatives, by shortening the menu, by making sure that the only thing left to eat is the thing you don't want to eat. And at the same time, they are indirectly, or depending on your views, maybe inadvertently or perhaps intentionally, undermining the potential for reconciliation, for finding solutions that work for you and that work for the other interests that the Crown has to protect. So the dam age may be over, but unfortunately the damage to relationships between the Crown and First Nation continues.